I weighed 100 pounds soaking wet when I went to high school. And on top of that, I was a Jewish kid in the South. And oh, did I mention it was an all-boys Catholic high school? It was the first day of 9th grade, and I slid into my chair in homeroom, and the kid in front of me turns around in his seat, and he says to me in front of the whole class, "You're going to hell because you killed Jesus." You see, I felt like an imposter, like an outsider who didn't belong. And I suffered from that most of my life, a scrawny little Jewish kid in the South. And so I learned to live with that feeling of not belonging from an early age. Now, I'm not here to tell you that I had it the worst, because that would be naive and ridiculous and quite literally one of the stupidest things that I could say. But I do stand here today to say at this women's event that discrimination shows up in all sorts of ways. And it takes courage to imagine that we can find our own sense of belonging. Finding my own sense of belonging has been about making 3 simple decisions about my life. They're what I call the 3 who's. The who I wanted to be, the who I wanted to surround myself with, and the who I wanted to serve. And for me, the who I wanted to be all started off with my grandmother, Faye. She was the matriarch of my family, and she was a strong and imposing woman despite her narrow little frame. She wasn't necessarily tall, but she carried herself tall, especially with her beehive hairdo and her straight back. She was always very well kept, down to the long gloves that she wore, even in the summertime. She was old school, and she had old school values, but she was also a college graduate, which was rare at that time for a woman. I remember once, when I was 10 years old, we were at a party, and an older man in his 50s came over to me and asked me where I was from. I said, Little Rock. And he leaned over me and he said, "No, but I mean, where are you really from?" I looked up at him with the back of my neck straining, and I said, "I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas," adding the Arkansas in case that was what he was looking for. But he leaned over me further and he said, "No, but I mean, where are you really from?" By this time, a crowd had formed around us. And I was feeling confused and embarrassed and frankly a little scared. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. And of course, I was too young to understand what was going on at the time. But my grandmother wasn't. And she was on the scene and in the man's face in no time. She said, "We're from right here in Little Rock, Arkansas," stomping her foot and dispersing the crowd like mice. She took me by the arm and led me out of there. And afterwards, in the car, when we were leaving, her eyes were focused. She said, "Philip, that man was anti-Semitic. He was saying that we don't belong. But I want you to know that we're Americans and we do belong, and don't you ever forget it." I remember that even though she was a bit agitated, she was composed, and I could feel her confidence. She was no imposter. Now, life doesn't operate in a straight line, and I never fully connected with my Judaism. But what I took from my grandmother was her unique mix of humility and confidence. She taught me the courage to live my values, even when it was something as simple as just being who I am. The problem was that never came easy for me, because I didn't know who I wanted to be when I was in high school looking at colleges, and I didn't know who I wanted to be when I was in college thinking about my career. And so I tried a lot of things. I started a company and I sold it. I worked in the startup space and I worked in the corporate world. I worked in tech and I worked in media. But all was not lost, because even though I took a lot of different paths, I always followed my interests. And my interest back in those days was in sales. And a woman named Catherine helped me realize this. Catherine was the top performing salesperson at the company I worked for at the time. She was small and fierce and always dressed to the nines. She would come breezing into and out of the office, coming and going to see clients, meeting with the leadership team. She was at the top of her game, and I was just enthralled. Catherine didn't say much, but when she did, it was never about herself. It was always about her client's success or the success of our company. And she wasn't like most people I knew. She was smart and assertive, but also kind and thoughtful. She reminded me of my grandmother. She had that same mix of humility and confidence. One day, she stopped by my cube and said, "Philip, how are you?" And at the time, I wasn't doing that well. I wasn't happy, and I wanted more. And I think she could sense this. After a brief conversation, she said, "Philip, what are you doing? You should get into sales." Now, at the time, I didn't have any sales experience, but her encouragement was the only support I needed. And so I did get into sales. And she was right. I was good at it. And over time, I worked my way up into a leadership position. But what I discovered was that I wasn't a traditional salesperson. I was in it because it mapped back to my passion for helping people. And so I was in it for the relationships, while those around me were in it for the hunt and the close. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I was different. And when I realized that, it was like, bam, imposter syndrome. I don't belong. Now, Catherine's insight was a game changer because even though sales wasn't my end destination, it led me into coaching. And coaching is who I am. And once I had discovered that, I set about making that decision on the second who, the who I wanted to surround myself with. And that happened when I was introduced to a community of coaches who shared my values in humility and confidence. That community is called EOS, and when I learned about them, I set off to go train with them in Detroit, Michigan, of all places. And I landed in Detroit in the middle of an icy cold and gray winter, and I found my way to the hotel conference room where they had assembled, and I opened the doors, and there staring back at me were the faces of 25 veteran entrepreneurs who all had 10 to 15 years on me at least. And as I met them, I learned of their incredible stories. There was the serial entrepreneur who had built and sold multiple million-dollar companies. There was an ultra marathoner who had lost 150 pounds to run a triathlon. There was a woman who had run an Ironman after having a double mastectomy. And so there I was swimming in this sea of ultra high performers, and it was just like, bam, imposter syndrome. I didn't measure up. However, this time was different because even though I had stretched out of my comfort zone, all of these people shared my values. And instead of competing against me, they were actually there to support me. And so I had finally found a group where I belonged. And so that leaves the third who, the who I wanted to serve. And this was a crucial piece for me, and one that I realized when I was working in London, overseeing the European operations for a technology company. We had had a good year, I had a good team in place, and we had just sold a 7-figure deal to one of our biggest clients. And we had taken them to a local pub to celebrate. The leader on the client side was a woman named Emily. And Emily was tough. She worked inside one of these big organizations that have a lot of bureaucracy and politics. And she really looked the part. She was battle-hardened and savvy and blunt. It was late afternoon on a Friday, and we had our teams assembled at a long table, and everyone was drinking pints. And Emily and I were at the head of the table when she looked over at me and she said, "You know, this is probably a bigger deal for you than it is for us." Now, she wasn't trying to be rude. We had grown close, and she had come to know me pretty well. But still, I was taken aback. I mean, here I was trying to show my appreciation for her business. I was picking up the tab, for God's sakes. I think I may have said, "Come again?" because I was trying to pick up those British mannerisms back then. And she said, "Well, you know, this is a small deal for us. And we do lots of these deals a year, and we do a lot bigger deals. But I'm guessing it's a big deal for your team and for your company." Well, just like that, bam, imposter syndrome. I didn't belong. And Emily was right. It was a big deal for my team, but clearly not for my client, and therefore not for me. I didn't want the service I was providing to not mean anything to the people I was providing it for. What I wanted was a deep sense of fulfillment and belonging. I wanted to matter to the people I served, and for them to matter to me. Fortunately, over time, I was able to achieve that. And through my coaching practice, I targeted clients that fit my values so that I enjoy serving them. And so, finding my own sense of belonging has been about deciding on the three who's. The who I wanted to be, the who I wanted to surround myself with, and the who I wanted to serve. Imposter syndrome has been an integral part of that journey. And I can see now how, in looking back on it, it induced fear. But I realize now that it was always like a true North Star for me, helping me determine where I needed to return to my values or move into a different group. And what's interesting is that humility has given me the courage to accept that feeling. I no longer expect to feel confident all the time when I start something new. And I don't expect to feel comfortable all the time. I've learned to take the leap first and then build up the capability that I needed afterwards. In many ways, I'm still that scrawny little Jewish kid in the South. That hasn't changed really. I haven't beaten back imposter syndrome completely, and frankly, I don't think I ever will. If I'm not feeling like an imposter, it means I'm not playing a big enough game. I'm grateful for all these amazing women in my life who have given me the courage to live my values, even when it was something as simple as just being who I am. The courage to imagine that I could find my own tribe and live my best life.